Good morning. This is Dr. Obertashaka, and this is the Dr. Obertashaka show. I believe this is the 52nd show, and the second one to be simulcast on Facebook and YouTube. And for those who go to the chat, you'll see on the chat the address for the Facebook part of this show that's simulcast at the same time. And the reason that I had this put up is because it can be confusing when you go to Facebook. There are a couple of pages that have Obertashaka on it, but if you look at the address here, https://www.facebook.com/Dr. Obertashaka. That'll get you there. And it's right there. And I'm going to have that also posted on my linkage underneath the show. When people are watching this show, there'll be a reference to the Facebook address. Brother Ugara is the first one on, and I'll see the stuff that you've done. It looks like you've done some real impressive work. I mean, I'm really inspired by that, brother. Going to drive me to work harder. So thanks. This is a special show. I always say that about the shows, but this one is really special because it goes to the heart of both African American and what I call New African or African culture, African American culture. So this is really getting to the heart and soul of the culture. For those that received a advertisement for this show, this is a very special leaflet here to promote this show, because on the other side of me is a picture of a group of singers called the McIntosh County Shouters. And I asked my computer master, Cinnabar, who just showed up on the chat there, to put that in there because they are still performing, and they perform in the old spiritual blues style, sung on the plantation with the same accent, same everything. And they do the ring shout, which is a counterclockwise dance coming out of Africa, started by the Twa, designed to harmonize the cosmos, because when Africans sang the spirituals, they generally danced, as we generally do to most things we do, even when it comes to dancing on the heads of our oppressors. So this is a historic picture right here. This was probably a picture recorded by the Library of Congress, because they've done some recordings before them. This is, as I pointed out already, this is the second show to be simulcast on Facebook and YouTube. And so for my many Facebook friends, you can see on this chat the address for Facebook, and you can tune in right there. And I'd suggested last week that everyone that has a platform should post every show, because if you post it, if you put the leaflet up there, this one here, or whatever the show is, and ideally post as many of them as you can, that is going to show an interest in the show. and it's going to attract more people to the altar rhythm. So I asked people to do that. I haven't seen anybody do it, but we need to increase viewership, and this is just one of many ways. I also want to do what I've done in every show is for the last 4 or 5 months is encourage people to sign up for the sixfold stages to mental freedom. And each show that we have done over quite a long period of time, to really be appreciated, you have to plunge into the system of transformation. And but that's not just so you can understand the show, but that so you can deepen your own sense of identity, self-knowledge, self-respect, and self-love. So this is crucial. And for those who are interested in the year-long webinar, you contact me at otashaka@sbcglobal.net. My topic for today could be considered part 2 of the last show. This is a deeper dive into the topic that I covered last week. The topic for today is the spirituals are the blues and are a new African cultural expression of African philosophy. The topic is the spirituals are the blues and they are a new African cultural expression of African philosophy. Now, this isn't going to be a show on the spirituals per se. It's the philosophy that undergirds them. And the spirituals, which I call the spiritual blues, and you'll see why in a little while, it's the foundation of our art form. Of all the beauty we have created, it is the most beautiful of the beautiful. And everything in the art form, which is extremely complex, rests on this foundation. So it's kind of like Ma'at, which is the foundation for African philosophy. This is the foundation for art form, which is the highest expression of new African culture. And I want to remind you that the European or the Aryan American has no art form that has been created in this country, no art form indigenous to this country. And there's good reason, because if you're engaged in genocide, slavery, theft of other people's, half of other people's country, that is northern Mexico, that kind of drowns out beauty. And Anglo-Saxon Protestants have never been good at this anyway. But generally, the Aryan, whether Anglo-Saxon Protestant or not, beauty hasn't exactly been like their main drive. Power has been, and of course, hatred for the culture, not for everybody of that group. And so it's not surprising that they have not developed an art form in this country. Of course, they'll claim it's classical music or anything European, and the Europeans will tell them immediately, that's not yours, meaning you're Euro-American. What have you done here? You know, so that we could create both a culture that I call New African and an art form in the midst of one of the most horrendous experiences any people have ever undergone, other than Native Americans. They underwent genocide. Or our African brothers and sisters in Australia and places like that, they underwent genocide. That's the most horrific, is when you're wiped out. They got 90% of Native Americans. They're coming back. But in that horrendous time, we could create beauty. And this is beauty beyond expression. No description of this can describe it It has to be experienced. But it's not only the beauty of the sound, it's the beauty of the thought, because it reflects some of the most profound, deep thought, which is Jacob Carruthers' term for African philosophy, or deep knowledge, the Dogon expression for African philosophy. It's the most profound, some of the most profound stuff you're going to find anywhere. And it's embedded in the souls of Black folks, to paraphrase W.B. Du Bois, who deeply appreciated this culture in spite of his own contradictions, because we all have contradictions. That's what life is about, growing. So this discussion will show how the old cultural expression of Africa, rooted in the deepest thought, was morphed into a new cultural expression, one of many proofs that African American culture is a new African culture that rests on an old foundation, but is a new expression. Wrap your head around that. While our people experience misery, we went into our souls and created beauty, and we continue to do it. But this is at its most beautiful and complex level. Last week, I discussed African conceptions and practices of manhood and womanhood that for thousands of years enabled us to develop personal balance, family harmony, and cosmic order. And so I was using the Dogon and Kemetic and Bambara systems to explain it, with the heavy emphasis on the Dogon. In that discussion, I used the Dogon conception of cosmic twinness through what the Dogon uses their teaching method of Dunuso, which means sign or knowledge of the universe. To last week, I was using that symbol of Adunaso to discuss how astrophysics, which Dogon philosophy is grounded in, ties into conceptions of what it means to be a human being and what it means to be a man or a woman. And I was tying that into Sirius B and Iminya, Sirius B being a dwarf star out of which the Dogon believed the cosmos was created. Astrophysicists all agree that the cosmos, this cosmos, the Milky Way neighborhood, came into being through the explosion of a dwarf star. And Sirius B is defined by the Dogon as that dwarf star. While European astrophysicists are divided over whether or not there's a companion star, the Dogon are clear. Companion star, it's Eminya. And Western astrophysicists note that there's a pull on the orbit of Sirius B. And the Dogon not only tell you the pull, but they tell you the orbit and the nature of that planet. So last week, we were talking about how Sirius B reflects the twin principle of the masculine, and Iminya reflects the twin principle of the feminine. And of course, you didn't expect to be approaching this discussion from that standpoint, because we're used to discussing masculine and feminine on an individual level. But Africans don't separate the person from the cosmos. I also use the seventh numo, N-O-M-M-O or N-U-M-M-O, which means word, which are spirit forces that come to earth in the Dogon system to assist God. in furthering God's creation. God is called Amma, A-M-M-A, in the Dogon system. So I use that to point out that for the Dogon, perfection wasn't just freedom from fault, though they struggled with that. It was the balance of males and females and the synthesis of the masculine and feminine. Synthesis meaning a male's going to have more masculine, the female's going to have more feminine, but it's the internal working of these two so that they're in harmony that is key to what it means to be man or woman, what manhood and womanhood means, and what it means to be a balanced human being, because that's the essence of what it means to be human, is to balance the forces that lie within you, inclining towards, hopefully deeply inclining towards truth and justice, which was the other theme that I discussed last week, which was the ideal man and ideal woman, which the Kemites call Jeremiah and the Bambara call Ma, telling you that there's a cultural unity of African thought. And the Bambara had a beautiful expression for this, describing Ma as a well-regulated person who was inwardly in good order and who respected themselves. This is some high stuff. You know what I mean? This is going beyond the intellectual discourse on Ma'at, because we just trigger off harmony, truth, justice, balance, right order, blah, blah, you know? But this is actually telling you what it's based on, and which is centrally the truth, adhering to the truth. But it's particularly talking about how the forces that lie within each of us have to be regulated. See, we're getting into spirit talk. Most of us, when we talk about chemistry, it's fact talk, but it's usually not spirit talk. And this is because you're dealing with a living African culture, and all African cultures are fundamentally spirit-based. And so we all have forces within us. And the question is, how do we regulate those forces? Some of those forces come from, what we bring from heaven. Now, I know some of you are questioning this, but I point out that when you get into spirit science, then the best place to go is the root, and the root is Africa. And all African systems believe, traditional and ancient, that we are spirits who came from heaven to earth. My name, Tashaka, comes from the Zulus. Zulu means heavenly people, and that in heaven, we made a compact in the presence of God. I've gone through this on the Ka series, and we picked our destiny, and then we forgot it. And then the challenge in life is to remember it. You may not remember being before God, making the compact, though some do, but you should remember your essence, which is why you're here. And you find that through your gifts. So, we've gone through that before. So part of the forces that we need to regulate inside of us are the destiny forces that we picked in heaven. And those destiny forces also have positive and negative qualities that we bring in. And then we have the forces that come through our experience in family and community and culture in the world. And these can create harmony or disharmony. And in this society, a lot of disharmony. And so the question is, how do we deal with those forces? Because the regulation of them are going to determine how you're able to regulate the outside, because you're a miniature cosmos in this larger one. So how are you going to be able to affect change in the world if you haven't achieved some kind of harmony within yourself, which isn't easy to do when you're under oppression. But actually, it ain't that hard either. Get in the fight, baby, on your level. You know, that's the greatest freedom. Every prisoner wants to escape. Every oppressed person wants to put down the system that oppresses them. You know what I mean? So regulating your internal forces, that's spiritual work. It's also political, it's social, it's economic, it's on many different levels. So this was a part of the discussion that I had last week. Now, I understand some people will have trouble with this discussion because, we're used to this individual thing of the male and female, but tying it to the cosmos, we'll say as above, so below. And in previous shows, I pointed out how we are stellar dust. Everything that composes us, our physical composition, is the same stuff that's found in the stars. These white boys are just figuring this out. African systems knew this from the beginning. As above, so below. Everything God created is a reflection of the whole. We're all microcosms of a macrocosm, a smaller reflection of a larger thing. That's true of what God's created, period. And that's certainly true of the human being. But when we get down to the rubber hit the road and start talking about we're cosmic beings and everything else, that's kind of hard to digest. First of all, you're turned off to astrology. Some of my best people didn't watch the 3 shows I did on astrology because the Catholic Church got in your head, messed you up. You saw the Pope up there grinning at your president, because I don't want to say your president, but the president. Both Catholics. You know what I mean? The Pope's got the biggest astrological library in the world. Run around here getting people to think that it ain't real. As my sister said, Sandra Bradley, who was on the show 3 times, she said she had talked to a priest once, and she was saying, why do you all put down astrology? He said, well, we know it's powerful, but if we get people to believe in it, we'll lose our power over them. And how you lose your power? Because it's one system for knowing yourself. It's the spirit self. You know what I mean? So some people, I think, have trouble with digesting this, and others didn't. Some of them got it, but a lot of people have trouble with the stuff I covered last week. One, because it had a lot of moving parts, as one person said. It had Dogon thought, it had Kemetic thought, it had Bambara thought, it had things like internalization. What does that mean? And this was particularly difficult to understand, I would say, for this, because we're used to receiving what we call knowledge through just facts. And then we hear them, and then we can repeat them, and we can talk about them. But we're not used to the experience. We're not used to the fact that knowledge is really conveyed through experience by being what you know, by being. The process of being is an ongoing process. It's a transformational process. So somebody can expose you to something, but it's a question of what you do with it. And in the case of what I covered last week, it was years of me taking Dogon and Kemetic and Yoruba and Asante and Bambara and other African philosophies, and then African American, and viewing them correctly. That took years. And then working to put them inside myself, to work against the imbalance that I had, not just with identity, but with the cosmos, which is what Dogon philosophy has done. And so describing something is one thing, like we do on this show. Experiencing it is another thing. And so those who have gone through a certain amount of experience are going to understand this better. Those that haven't, less so. those who are more political but less spiritual are going to have more trouble when we go into the spiritual stuff. And I notice a lot of women, because, I look at these analytics here, a lot of the sisters, when we get into the serious historical stuff, they're vacant. I mean, I was looking at some of the analytics on Dr. Theophilus Benga when we interviewed him. Heavily male. Why? That's your root. I know why, because the sisters are more inclined towards the spiritual stuff, the stuff that you put inside. But then there are other sisters who are inclined to both. And the same with the brothers, more inclined to the political and the historical. But when it comes to the spiritual, not so much. I mean, if you can't express your feelings, you're going to definitely have some difficulty dealing with spirit within and all the rest of this stuff. So I did this review on the last show because I know that some people have trouble. And then a lot of people, when they hear the unfamiliar, they want to hear the familiar. I don't do that. I'm not repeating stuff that people already know. Just like I don't want to just talk to the people in my age group. That's fine. But I also want to get to younger folks. That's why I'm doing the show. You know what I mean? So some of my stuff may be familiar to me, but it may not be to a lot of people. But I'm just not into going through and repeating the familiar that people know, half of which is true and half of which isn't. You know what I mean? So this is part 2 of last week. And in the end, if we're really going to get this, then it's the experience that really matters. The sixfold stages to mental freedom is a part of that, but that's an experience, and it only works if it's tied to what you're doing in your life. And when I finish this book on mastery, you're going to have another system that you can use, because when we were undergoing this transformation, those of us who underwent the most deep transformation, we were being guided by masters. And that's not something I'm going to be getting into today. But that was all a part of the experience of knowing the truth to be the truth. So this is part 2. And hopefully this will help you get deeper into this. But this is magnificent beauty that's being described here, but also complexity, but simplicity. It's in your basic makeup. A lot of people who aren't what you call philosophers, they live this stuff. And the less exposed you've been to this brainwashing system, then the more you're going to be practicing this stuff. So when I was giving personal examples last week on how this worked on me, that wasn't an ego thing. That was to show that this works. There's a method for applying this to yourself. And that method was a method that Malcolm used, that Cabral used, a number of people have used. And for us, it occurred in the heat of battle, but it can occur in any life situation. But it's a method that comes through awakening. It comes through study. It comes through practice. It comes through working on yourself internally, your weaknesses, to transform them to strengths, so that all of this is what produces a transformation. So this is internal work we have to do so that we're in internal good order. And it means that we're working on synthesis at different levels. So one level, it's identity. Another level, it's the masculine, feminine. Another level, it's the spiritual and the physical. Another level, it's the political and it's the spiritual, and so forth. So it's this work. It's just like a garden. You got to tend to it, otherwise the weeds grow. And this is a constant thing. And this isn't just spiritual, it's physical, tending to your health, the same thing. So what I've been trying to do with this discussion and a lot of others is to give you some keys to opening your internal door, which is a door to transformation. I just see James P.A.P.O come on. He said, "Isn't repetition fundamental principle of communication?" Yes, that's true. And he's listed a number of things. Yeah, it is. But always try and put something new in there so you don't put people to sleep. So then the key to this transformation is, of course, drawing from African and African American history. That's real key. And for a people who have been put on an amnesiac historical diet, which is zero or negative, you didn't do anything. And then it gets translated into popular sayings that the N isn't S, you know what I mean? It gets translated like that. And then you're in what Gore Vidal, one of the radical, at least international thinkers of this country, called the US of A, the United States of amnesia. So you're living among amnesiacs, you know what I mean? Except there's a difference. They have a sense of greatness, even when it's not deserved and not true. And that's true of most people who come in here that didn't undergo this enslavement experience. Very few people in any group know their people's history. Very few. That's usually the intellectual endeavor. But they have a sense of it. And that sense of it is empowering. And they know key tools. Like most Chinese know certain things to tell their children to do to be successful in a society that, is stacked against them. So they have certain survival skills that have come through Confucianism. Yet they probably don't know a lot about Confucius, most of them. Some of them do. You know what I mean? So history is real important, especially for people who've had their history stepped on. And a lot of us have been turned off to it so much, we think that we shouldn't have to have anything to do with it. It won't do us any good. That's the past. You are your past. And how much of it you know will depend on whether you're drawing from the best or worst part. And if your enemy knows your past and you don't, they got power over you. And guess what? And most whites don't know that past, but the ones who are leading your oppression, they know enough to know what to do to you. And especially if you don't know. So African and African American history are very important. Some of us know African history is important, but don't study African American history. If you don't study African American history, how can you apply your past to the present? And also, how can you really know the nature and greatness of your own people, as well as your strengths and weaknesses? How can you know that? So you have to do both. And in the awakening process, that's key. You just can't be on one level, on one plane. You've got to deal with both because you've got to apply the past to the present, as I pointed out before. So history is very important in terms of reshaping identities and in terms of having a long vision of the future. When you have a long vision of the past, it gives you creative source to draw from. It gives you a lot of strengths. But historical roots, knowing our historical past, while absolutely necessary, because as Malcolm said, you need to love your roots, as I would say, to love the fruit. You know what I mean? And to know one, to know the other. So this is crucial. But what's often neglected when we're talking about building a strong people is the importance of us knowing the deep thought of a people, which Europeans call philosophy, which Africans, when we use it, we call it deep thought, but it is a a system that's spirit-based. For them, it's, as I pointed out before, despiritualized. They're proud of that. Their whole culture is stripped of spirit, even though people experience it individually. But culturally, they frown on it, you know? But if we are going to really draw from history, we need to know the deep thought of a people, the deep structure of a culture. And when you know the deep thought and deep structure of a culture, which is where the deep thought, is, that's what it is, then you'll understand a people's history, because you'll understand how they viewed the world, how they viewed the cosmos, how they viewed themselves, how they viewed others. And because very often they're drawing from universal cosmic truths, then a lot of what you find out about how people saw themselves yesterday will apply to how you see yourself today. So if you just know history, you just know facts, dates, and places. But when you know a people's view of the cosmos, of their relationship to the cosmos, their view of themselves and their relationship to the world, then you really understand your story. And you understand it from an in-depth level. So what we know about a people's thought yesterday will give us a deep understanding of the cultural roots and deep thought of our people today. And that will be very important in terms of how we negotiate the trials of life. I've said this before, I have to keep repeating it, that contrary to popular opinion, the culture of Africans in the United States was not destroyed during enslavement. In fact, the only way you can destroy a people's culture is wipe them out, genocide. And even then, as the last Mohegans, I used to watch that when I was a kid, the last Mohegan, the last of the Mohegan people. As long as one lives, the culture lives. And Native Americans have proved it. They knocked out 90% of them, and they're coming back. You know what I mean? They're coming back. So slavery couldn't destroy our culture. It destroyed certain vestiges of it, and certain ones we brought back, like the drum. The drum was outlawed. They couldn't do that in the Caribbean, too many Africans there. But here, yeah. But we just transferred the drum to every other part of our body, including our voice and our feet and everything else. And then over time, we also started recovering some stuff. But the main thing is the deep stuff you can't wipe out. Humanism. That's so deeply embedded in African people that I don't care what experience you put them through, you're going to see the continuation of caring and kindness. And even though it's eroded a lot, especially under the post-1968 drug-infested problems, still, we find brothers and sisters who went through some of that horrendous stuff, some of whom died, OD'd, some continue on for the rest of their life, but many overcome it, transform themselves, and undergo awakenings. We had a show on that where, we were dealing with the various scars that our people experience during their lives. In this case, drug addiction and alcoholism and everything, and how people overcome that. And when they do, often come out better human beings. Why? Because there's something deep inside of you, but it was something that you carried over on the ship. It's something that's basic to your personality, caring about human beings. And that's deep in our makeup. And it's not something that we had to draw on a lot to remember. It's basic to what it is to be human being, is to be humane. That's our culture. That's not true of all cultures, but that is definitely our culture. So As I pointed out before, in the Caribbean, because Africans were the overwhelming majority on those islands, then you had a cultural continuity where African culture was continued. And it's called the hybrid culture. That is, an African culture and alongside of the European culture, and then some penetrating. But basically, the continuation of African culture, because the European just didn't have the numbers to intervene on the culture. Here they had more, but we were a majority on most of these plantations. Most of them were large plantations. And we could continue this culture here too, but it was harder because of successful settler colony and genocide and knocking off Native Americans and others. And so it was a harder thing for us to go inside ourselves and create what I call a new African culture. It's a recreation, taking what we already have and then also in a new form, taking old principles in a new form, and then bringing in new ones like Pan-Africanism, like race consciousness. Race consciousness was a necessity based on how we were oppressed, based on the color of our skin, and tribe no longer becoming relevant in this country after a period of time. But Pan-Africanism was really an outgrowth of a bigger vision that comes out of race consciousness, and that we see ourselves as African as opposed to Yoruba, Dogon, Asante. And there's nothing wrong with Yoruba, Dogon, and Asante. Those are specific ethnic cultures that are great. But in this particular case, we used our imaginations and began to see the whole. So this is part of this new African cultural creation that occurs here. And that's why our ethos is creativity that I pointed out before. So while you could outlaw some formal vestiges, you really couldn't outlaw the African, because you could, as the old saying goes, take the African out of Africa, but you couldn't take Africa out of the African. You hear me? It's in you. It's deep inside of you. Even when we're in denial and say, I ain't no African, I don't want to be African. Just like we used to say, I don't want to be black. You know what I mean? The reality is that's what you is. And the reality is your likes and dislikes go accordingly. You know? The things you like tend to be African. You just don't know they're African. You just know you like them. I'm not talking about you that are watching this show. I'm talking about our people in general, because I know most of you do. So don't get me wrong. I know who I'm talking to. By identifying the continuation of key principles of African philosophy and African American deep thought and philosophy, we can understand how our people have been able to make the past serve the present. This becomes the way we can produce psychological, philosophical, and collective transformation today. In other words, contrary to popular opinion, where the popular opinion is they wiped the culture out, the truth is the enslaved African was the most African among us. Yeah, they had scars, they had hell they faced. But the fact is they were most African. And so if we're going to understand how to negotiate the trials today, understand how they did it. That is going to help you, as well as understand the source, the root. And African deep thought is key to that. That's why the subject for today is the spirituals of the blues, a new African cultural expression of African philosophy. As I said before, this ain't going to be a show on singing. This is going to be a show on what's behind it, the thought pattern, the philosophy, the deep thought. So when we can link central principles of African and African American culture or African Caribbean culture and philosophy to its roots, then when we get to the roots, we have the pristine model, like we had with Jeremiah, you know what I mean? The ideal model for what it is to be human. That is not easy to even talk about, let alone to conceive. Model person, you know? So when we can identify and utilize African and New African philosophy and deep thought and internalize it, and that's a whole nother thing that people will have trouble with. What does internalization mean? It's the process for being. It's a way in which you take knowledge, digest it, and discard what's useless, and then take the rest of it and nourish yourself with it. That's a process for knowing and becoming what we know. That's a process, internalization. And that is really the basis for, or at least one basis for, transformation. So when we have this pristine model, that's the source, that's the root. And then we look at how that fruit was developed here and how that model got translated into our reality and how do we use it. And this is what's real key is, again, if we understand really what our ancestors were up against, our enslaved ancestors, and how they handled what they were up against, then we'll understand that, just as Cabral made the assertion that a people's chance for achieving liberation is measured by the difference between the culture of the oppressed and the culture of the oppressor, the African, the saltwater African coming into this country came in with their own culture. And then over time, that gets transformed in what becomes a new African culture. But because it was founded on some fundamental, deep thoughts, deep systems, then it empowered the enslaved African to transcend the reality that they were oppressed under. That means that their minds could go somewhere else. Their thoughts could go somewhere else. And it could be very key to their success in any effort for freedom, whether it was spiritual, physical, political, social, whatever. And that was something that they carried. And so at one point, I've talked about before how enslaved Africans lived outside of time. Well, that was a spirit mindset. That means they weren't just there counting 400 years. That means that because of their connection with a higher source, then time went by quicker. Or as Malcolm's mother advised him, when you're in prison, don't serve time. Let time serve you. She knew that because she had been locked up in a nut house when all she had was a nervous breakdown and had overcome it and had been there for years before they got her out. She knew that. So that's the reality of when you're drawing from your deep thought. It enables you to transcend your reality. That is, it gives you equipment, in this case, spiritual and mental equipment, political and social equipment, that takes you to a higher level than that of your oppressor. And while I hear Black people talking about how smart white people are, well, it depends on which ones you're talking about. What I mean? Every group has their smart people, and some people who are running the system are smart. Some of them are, and these are usually managers trained at Harvard, Yale, and places like that. But guess what? You're smarter, especially when you know your stuff, when you're into your own deep structure, and in this case, your own deep thought. So when the deep thought we draw from is based on cosmic truth, then we're in a real powerful position because we're drawing on deep thought that transcends the individual, that's even bigger than social systems or political or economic systems that we find on this earth. It enables us to build systems that are replicas of the cosmos on Earth. And that's what African people did. I'm not going into for some time twinlineal families, but that's basically what they were. They were replicas of how the cosmos operated in male-female relationship. So contrary to false white historical narratives believed by too many Blacks, Africans who came into this country, far from being broken, were toughened by enslavement. Their spirits couldn't be broken. People are not animals. And even animals, a horse or anything else, if you go the broken route, there's a time where that horse is going to get tired of you and throw you, you know. Or these lion trainers, there's a time where the lion decides, well, you look like a good meal, you know. And, you know, you think that you've broken that lion. That lion's got a spirit. But this African, it's very hard to break the spirit of a human being. And while, you know, you read the slave narratives and you can see where sometimes people were put into a very dismal place. Many times you also have the accounts of what it took for them to rise out of it. And that is the nature of this African. He was determined to survive and overcome the monster of enslavement. That was their view. That was the overall view of enslaved Africans. And this was the view of free men and women of color as well, who supported the moves for the freedom of their enslaved brothers, which they had been a week or a year, a few years ago, many of them running away. So the deep thought that I'm going to be identifying today, that it's a pillar in the culture of Africans in the United States and Africa, grew out of a people who had a vigorous sense of African pride, who were utterly uncompromising and were opposed to the idea of being a slave for life. Their song, which in my piece on the spiritual blues, which I consider to be my best piece, the song that embodied the spirit of the enslaved African was, "Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave, go home to my Lord and be free." Well, that's a statement of people that haven't been enslaved. Before I'll be a slave. So what they're telling you is they may have chains around my wrists and my ankles, but not around my mind. You hear me? And so this enslaved African didn't accept that condition and accepted no human being as their master. And, you know, when I use the term master in the apprenticeship system, that's an African term, grand master. It could be a Hogan, a priest, whatever. These are people who have mastered their character and certain skills in life. And this is very different from someone who's mastering over you. And so it's a whole different concept. So this pride that the African carried to the US, the Western Hemisphere, was African pride confined in a space that they rejected and confined in someone else's view of them that they didn't accept. So the question is, so what was the foundation of this persistent optimism? What was the gut reason that kept our people going? What was the gut reason? Because the assumption that slavery destroyed our culture is the assumption that, you know, according to E. Franklin Fraser, when we got off the boat, Africa was gone. That's ridiculous. You know, 144,000 years of history. And in this case, a middle passage that took months or whatever, and a lot of people died and some survived. You're going to tell me that when you stepped off the ship, it was gone. And then some will say it's after they put some water on you and baptized you. Most Africans in enslavement were not Christians. They rejected it, overwhelming majority. And when they embraced Christianity, it was on their terms. They were using a term to describe something else, which was a culture they had practiced for 240 odd years and enslavement, whatever, And that was then called voodoo. It was a mixture of stuff. And that stuff is still up inside the Black church. They were smart. They called it Christian and then could use it for their own purposes. A lot of us don't know this history. And so we got the wrong idea that we just fell for the Willie Lynch thing. There was no Willie Lynch. Black people are too smart to fall for that. You know what I mean? Huh. So what was the foundation of this persistent optimism? The foundation of this cultural resistance, the foundation of this deep thought, a key principle of which I'm going to focus on today, was the knowledge, and this comes out of 144,000 years of experience, but it came out of their immediate experience of wherever you came from, and then from generation to generation, that continued to be the view that the Spirit of God was everywhere, in the air, in the storms, in the sunshine, inside of us, inside of everything around us. So there was a spiriosity, there's no such word, I just created that, spiriosity that imbued us, that some people call religiosity. There's no word in any African language for religion, as I pointed out before. And African spirit practices were not based on a book, was not based on a divine person, and it was not based on some printed laws. Our ethics came from how we treated each other. God didn't have to tell us to do right. In fact, remember in Meru Neter, God ingests Ma'at. That's interesting. You know what I mean? Indicating that it's a force of the cosmos in and of itself. I'm not saying that that's absolutely true, but that's the Kemetic idea. You know what I mean? And that's a woman with an ostrich feather on her head. You know what I mean? So that notion of ethics, of kindness, of goodness, all those things, that was nurtured in men and women relating to each other, children and elders, and young people, parents and sons and daughters, and the community or the village relating to each other. So spirit was a total experience, and therefore a total expression. The African who came here, and for a long time afterwards, and I'm going to show you it still continues, though we have to struggle with it now. For them, there was no separation between sacred and secular, or spiritual and physical, or spiritual and material, or mind and spirit. There was no separation. It was all one. And so that is the foundation that the African carried from the mother country here. And it was transplanted into this soil and into the souls of Black folks. And it's a major reason why Blacks during enslavement, the overwhelming majority, did not embrace Christianity, because they saw it out of line with these spirit beliefs, and most importantly, the practice of truthfulness and justice. And so how are they going to embrace something that was founded on dehumanization? How are they going to do that? And the few Africans that embraced Christianity during slavery rejected the Pauline epistles that said, slaves, obey your masters. They refused that. So this story of they hoodwinked us, that's contrary to everything. If anything you know about Black people, we're about the hardest people to hoodwink. You hear me? Hardest. Because we're pretty good at reading truth and falsehood. So the creators of this new African culture and this deep thought system that I'm going to be focusing on, they did not accept the Platonic Puritan dichotomy where good was separate from bad. Plato created an idea called the form. And the form was something he got from Socrates. Socrates learned from the Chemites that there was a time in heaven where pre-existing forms existed, and that's what human beings carried. And so the pre-existing form was an idea. It could be love, or it could be courage, or whatever. They took this from what the Dogon would call adunoso, and the Chemites had a comparable set of concepts where the invisible spirit is the source of what becomes material later. But what Plato does is separate this form and put it in a special hierarchy. And he actually puts the form higher than God. And he makes the form knowable through reason, and reason without spirit. You hear me? Reason without spirit. And so what we get is despiritualized reason. Plato ain't the only one. This is a Western project. And in fact, he has one foot in the spirit world, one not. But by and large, he is moving this to a despiritualized thing by reducing the status of God. Order and hierarchy for him is the thing. And reason is the highest thing. And the rest of Western thinkers fall in line. The African coming into this country had no such idea, of good here and bad there. So he had this idea of the good, this is this high level, but it's separated from everything else, in this case, from bad. And the higher is separated from the lower. And in his world, the philosopher king ruled in his republic, which was modeled after the warlike state of Sparta, which was a state in constant warfare. Partially modeled after Kemet, in that the philosopher king shared certain qualities with the pharaoh, but basically this was a despiritualized system. And ethics does not figure as a thing that ran that system. What ran that system was top dog, and the top dog was the top thinker. Today, it would be the psychopathic corporate head that's pulling the world's strings and putting people on $2 a day. It just defeated a lot of measures inside of Biden's infrastructure plan that would benefit poor people, and the people doing it, Manchin and his compatriot, are dancing the corporate tune, getting big money in the case of Manchin, coal money and other fossil fuel money. So the African coming in here saw spirit as reality all around him and inside of him and her. So the foundation beam of New African culture had no idea of reason separate from spirit. Their philosophy for living united the above with the below, heaven with earth, and it empowered them to resist and create, because they believed that they had some great powers inside of them. It didn't come from no book. It came from within. Now, what this philosophy of life that enslaved Africans drew from within, that enabled them to keep on going, it was a philosophy in us that empowered us to pursue freedom. It was in us in the Black Power movement of the 60s. It rested on a mental, spiritual sense of freedom. It came to us from Africa through these saltwater Africans. And in the 60s, when we were now free to identify these sources, we could now go and draw from Dogon, Yoruba, Kemetic, Asante, and others. And then as time went on, know about more and draw from more. But these saltwater Africans, of course, they didn't come from Kemet, but they drew from this deep well that they carried from their particular cultural group. And that becomes what gets forged into what becomes later New African culture. Malcolm, most brilliant mind we produced, at least in the second half of the 20th century, if not the whole 20th century, when it comes to political mind. He found his path after undergoing this awakening, seeing the light through the sixfold stages to mental freedom, where he drew from our history and drew from our deep thought. This dive into our past changed our philosophies from imitative to creative, from either or to twin, from assimilated to African. It was this shift in philosophy based on a study of history. And that's how Malcolm would describe his change. His first change was philosophical. So what was this central principle of African philosophy that was distilled into African American culture? This philosophical deep thought tradition blended the sacred and the secular, the spiritual and the political, and the physical and the spiritual. It blended it. This was like at the foundation of this. This philosophy, at its highest expression, is expressed through the spiritual blues. Since it is the foundation of the art form, it is the most magnificent expression of beauty and complexity and simplicity at the same time. So, what's this thing about the spiritual blues? I told you it's not about singing. And from now, it's not about swinging, though it inspires, obviously the swinging may not be obvious, but it did. And it was expressed through the singing and the rhythm. So with your Western thought pattern, you will say that this thing rests on the spiritual blues. That's not possible because the spirituals came before the blues. How you got the spiritual blues? You're going to say that. And a lot of you following the Western model will separate the spirituals from the blues. And so, you know what I mean? So how you have the spiritual blues? This don't make sense. You know what I mean? I would, and by the way, I didn't get this from Dizzy Gillespie, but I will note Dizzy's observation on this. This is a book on Dizzy, To Be or Not to Bop. To Be or Not to Bop. That's a takeoff on Shakespeare, To Be or Not to Bop. One of my specialty African-American music, you know what I mean? Huh? Love the music. And I know a lot of you, it's your healing force. Dizzy made the observation that, and I didn't get this from Dizzy, but Dizzy had the profundity to see this because he's one of our deep thinkers, not just one of our greatest musicians. Dizzy said, well, the spirituals were the blues too. And then he said, it would take a psychologist to understand that. Ha ha. Meaning, yeah, you whites wouldn't understand that. This is endemic to us. And by the way, Dizzy had trouble with the blues for a long time. He didn't play it because he associated it with slavery, just like a lot of you, not you watching the show necessarily, but a lot of our people. They say, I don't like the blues. It makes me blue. That's because they're going by the name. These names we didn't pick. You know what I mean? The blues ain't associated with suicide. Country music is. Because the blues is always twin. You hear me? And I'll get into that in a minute. The blues picks you up when you're down. How can beauty bring you down? And the blues is about the man and the woman. How can that not be interesting? You mean you ain't interested in that? Oh, give me a break. You know what I mean? You alive, aren't you? Your mama gave birth to you, didn't she? You know what I mean? Huh? So, what does it mean? Spiritual blues. If you're coming out of a Western mindset, that makes sense that it didn't, you know, the blues came later. So you can't have no spiritual blues. Um, and you can't have spiritual blues because in the Western mindset, good and bad is separate. Spirit and reason is separate. So how can you have these two, you know? Spirituals, that's the spirituals. Blues, that's the non-spiritual. That's the Western mode of thinking, just like masculine and feminine are separate. They're interactive. You can't have one without the other, you know? It takes two to tango. Fortunately, the edifice of new African culture rests on a complex thought system full of contradictory ideas. So let's get the full of this. The spirituals are the blues. This is at the foundation of this philosophy. Get this one. Digest this. The spirituals are the blues, and the blues are the spirituals. Gospel is sacred blues. Rhythm and blues is gospel blues. Jazz is the blues and the spirituals. Funk is the blues, and hip hop is urban blues. Now that's the art form. You hear me? Huh? You get it? There's a philosophy in that. Oh, it's a bad one. And it's inside of you. Uh-oh. You don't have to be no philosopher to express this. In fact, the deepest people I know are the ones who haven't had to be taken through all of this philosophical stuff. They just have guides for living and they're deep truths. So you will say, how can this be? The same way that above is below and good is bad. In the African American philosophical framework, when you say bad, what does that mean? You know what it means. It means good, not bad. That means bad. Bad. No good for nothing, bad person. That means something else. But bad means good. You hear me? Because the deep thought of Africa, part of it, rests on twinness. And it's always things together. It's never alone. So how can the spirituals be the blues when the blues are supposed to have come after the spirituals? First, the term spirituals is not a good term for this music. And white people came up with that term. You know what I mean? The spirituals is much more about the blues because it's dealing with everyday life. It's a commentary on history, just as the blues is. If you want to get a real good commentary on history, read the lyrics of the spiritual blues. If you want to know the psyche of the people that created this, read the lyrics of the spiritual blues. If you want to understand the thought pattern, read the lyrics of the spiritual blues, but also the sound, a mixed sound. One of the most beautiful sounds this side of heaven. And it infuses all the art forms that we've created. And so the reason why the spirituals are the blues is because the spirituals are more about the hell we're facing on earth than anything about heaven. And when you're talking about heaven, it's a code word for other things like freedom. Big code word for freedom. There's a spiritual song that says, you can have this world, but give me Jesus. One translation of that is that you can have the world of slavery and give me the good ship, Jesus, that you brought me here on so I can get back home where I'm free. You understand? That was a meaning. Or I've said this one before, wade in the water, children, God's going to trouble the water. Wade in the water, God's going to trouble the water. Huh? That's an Igbo song. The Igbo, as I pointed out before, were called the Flying Africans. Most enslavers didn't want them because they had a high suicide rate. Why? Rather than suffer enslavement and loss of freedom, and they were people who even bargained with God when they were picking their destiny in heaven, they would go to the water and drown themselves so that their spirits could fly to Africa. You hear me? Wade in the water. That had a whole different meaning. It sounded innocuous to the slave master, so-called. Now, so how could the blues be the spirituals? Lerone Bennett, who I've mentioned before, best explained this in this book here called Negro Mood. It was published once as Black Mood. None of our major scholars have read it. Malcolm read it, though. I remember a picture of him, Socialist Workers' Party, and he had that book in his hand. Malcolm read it. But none of our leading Afrocentric scholars have read it. And I told them all, read it. Ain't none of them read it. You hear me? And I've told you this before. I knew Lerone Bennett. He would attend national C.O.R.E conventions. And I saw him when I was, a March marshal at King's Selma to Montgomery March, where I was arrested. That was my 17th arrest in the movement. And I went up to him, and that was right after the book had been published. That was 1965. And I asked him, I said, I already knew the answer. What's the best book you've ever written? Now, I've asked some good friends of mine, and they'll say The Making of Black America, The Shaping of Black America, or Before the Mayflower. Those are popular books. He was an African-American historian. But this book, less than 125 pages, I knew was his best book. But I thought I knew, because only the author knows their best work. And I went up to him. I said, what's your best work? I knew what he'd say. Negro Mood. And I pointed this out before. I'm getting ready to speak Million Man March, 1995. I'm on the stage. It was early in the morning. I spoke at 9:30 in the morning. It's 1 million black men out there packed together. And Lerone's on the stage. And I came up to him, shook his hand. The book Return to the African Mother Principle had just been published. And I showed him a copy. And I said, everything I write, I quote you. And he had 2 great chapters. I pointed this out before. One is Voices from the Cave, and the other one is The Black Establishment. Those 2 chapters make this book a classic. A classic is a rare book. Very few authors will write one. Very, very, very few. And I know that was inspired by King's Operation Confrontation, his Birmingham campaign. And you can see this was inspirational, this book, but it was profound and deep. And by the way, his book on the Black Establishment is the best analysis of the control group that Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois created, I don't think intentionally, but they created it, that is used to control blacks, the Black Establishment. It beat the Boule analysis by 100 miles. You know what I mean? Read it. But Voices from the Cave, that's the biggest jewel. And I give credit where credit is due. And I ain't trying to reproduce this one. This is what Lerone Bennett had to say about this jewel in the crown. I talk about the spiritual blues. He's talking about the blues of the spirituals. And this is what he had to say. He made the point, first of all, that I made, that this tradition was, first of all, one, where sacred and secular, spiritual, and, the human were together, not separate. And then he goes on to say this, and this is real profound stuff. And by the way, he didn't know he was identifying central principle in African culture. He knew this was New African or African American, but I don't think his area was African philosophy. So he didn't know this was an extension of that. In fact, he equated this statement to Zen Buddhism, which has some, resemblance, but the source is African, translated into America. So this is what he has to say. This is why the blues of the spiritual. This is the best statement here. The blues of the spirituals, good is bad. God is the devil. Remember, in Africa, there was no devil. And every day is Saturday. Now, he liked the Saturday emphasis. Most blacks would probably put it on Sunday, but he liked the Saturday emphasis. The essence of the tradition is the extraordinary tension between the poles of pain and joy, agony and ecstasy, good and bad, Sunday and Saturday. And then he goes on to say, one can, for convenience, separate the tradition into Saturday's blues and Sunday spirituals. But it is necessary to remember that the blues and the spirituals are not two different things. They are two sides of the same coin, two banks, as it were, defining the same stream. The sacred and secular union, where agony and ecstasy are joined, expresses the new African spirit, where pessimism is transcended by optimism. That's why you can't say the blues is sad music. The blues is always transcendent. It's always in the in up. It deals with the realities of the ups and downs of life, but it transcends. And therefore, pessimism is overcome by optimism. Europeans come out of a pessimistic, tragic bent culture. That is the nature of Greek art, tragedy. You know what I mean? Because these are cultures based on war and conquest, and tragedy is the result. You're up one day, win one day, lose the other. You're a slave the next, and then you've got the top bleeding the bottom, and that's almost everybody. So it's going to be a pessimistic, woe is me life, But the African didn't accept that. So this twin thought pattern of both spiritual and physical, sacred and secular, masculine and feminine, sadness and joy, agony and ecstasy, leads to beautiful expressions and a sense of transcendence, a sense that you can rise above things. How many times have I gone to a gospel concert? If there's a good one, I'm there. And someone talking about the blessings they received in their lives, and they caught more hell than hell could catch. You hear me? But they're looking at, there's something good they have. I'm at the Y, I say, how you doing, brother? He says, another good day, I woke up. And then we got some minimal definitions of health, certain things you could do. Like one brother said, he could pee straight. That was health. I said, oh, really? But it is optimism behind that. I think you could do better in looking after that health. So make sure there's more than that you can do. But I get your point. You know what I mean? So, so now what you are going to say, and what a lot of you are thinking and saying is, yeah, okay, there was this sacred, secular, spiritual blues thing in the beginning when this culture and art form was set up, but not now. You've been programmed to think that. You know what I mean? Because anything positive, it's kind of out of your picture. Most of us can't even count victories. We have a victory, we just move on. We don't even celebrate it. You kicked Trump out of the White House. There should have been a national celebration. Black people should have a national celebration on that. Some of us didn't even see it as a victory. Oh, they could see all the faults in Biden. Yeah, hell yeah, it's full of faults. But the agenda he's pushed has come from you and our allies, Not just Black Lives Matter, that was part of it, but this whole movement. You did it. Where's your victories? You know what I mean? So victimization is something that some of us seem to be wedded to. You know what I mean? You got victories, count them. You got defeats, learn from them so it won't happen again. So a lot of us will say, oh, yeah, well, so these Africans came here. They had this vision of the sacred and the secular being one, the spirits and everybody, but it's changed now. You hear me? It ain't the same anymore. Really? Remember, I told you this is deep thought. This is embedded deep in the culture. And so that's going to be hard to eradicate. It's like humanism. This twin thought thing, baby, it reflects reality, first of all. What's our assessment of a human being? It is, in the best of us, there's bad. In the worst of us, there's good. That's folk culture. It comes from folk culture. That's the best philosophical description of what it means to be human. Ain't got no author to it, Or I was sitting at a bus stop once, and a brother made this comment. This is real profound. He said, and this is around 66, 67, King and Malcolm were the same. And I went off in my little mind. I didn't say it to him, but to myself, I'm saying, oh, no, they aren't. I could think of the differences. But he was right. The unities outweigh the differences. You hear me? Huh? That's an everyday Black person. He ain't cracked no books on no philosophy. But the fact is, he got deep thought. And that deep thought comes from wisdom acquired through life. But it rests on this reality of this twin thing. This twin thing is you got more in common than separate you or make you different. So it is true that during enslavement and since, we have had alien consciousness intrude on our own, no question. In the case of the sacred secular union, the white mentality has divided the spirituals from the blues, and gospel from the blues, or what Jeremiah Wright, Obama's minister, called sacred blues. That's what he calls gospel music. Some of us say, I like gospel, but I don't like the blues. It's the same music, same sound. A musician will tell you the difference is one's focused on God, one's focused on the woman. If you're dealing with the spirituals, they're both pretty much the same because they were mainly focused on the conditions of Blacks on this earth. So you can say you like the gospel, but you don't like the blues. I have a cousin who's like that. When we go to concerts, he's sitting in the gospel tent the whole time. You know what I mean? Well, he's getting blues, the same sound, everything else, but he's saying he don't like the blues. You know what I mean? No, it's what you've been taught not to like. Because in the case of Dizzy Gillespie, he didn't play blues for a long time because Dizzy was into this belief that it was slave music until he listened to Charlie Parker. And then he realized the soul of Charlie Parker was the blues. And then if you listen to Coltrane, it's the blues that comes out of the church, the sanctified church especially, that he reproduced on his horn. And so he changed his view. He started to dip deep into the blues because you ain't really got good jazz unless you have the blues. But the key point is it's the sacred and the so-called secular, but they're combined. That's what jazz is. Jazz is spirit expression. You hear me? And a high mental expression. So if we look at it then, you have one, you got the other. They're linked. So it's true. We have to deal with warring souls on this sacred secular thing, like we have to deal with white cultural intrusion on other levels. Take Thomas Dorsey, for example. He's the father of gospel blues. He's the one that brings the blues sound into gospel music. But he's undergoing his little warring souls because he's been told this is the devil's stuff. You know what I mean? You're out here sinning when you're out here playing with Bessie Smith and the rest of them, you know? You ain't supposed to be doing this in church. But his deep thought overrode that. And when he came up with Precious Lord and then put Mahalia Jackson into the church, and then James Cleveland, the greatest male gospel singer ever, the composer of Peace Be Still, they blew the roof off the place. They brought the hush harbor back into the church, which is where you put your head under a bucket and drew the spirit down. And the preachers couldn't do anything about it because they were trying in Chicago and places like that to be sedity, you know, to make that church emotional enough to keep their members, but not emotional enough to bring down the spirit. Because white people didn't like that. Black people did. And they told them they weren't going to be in that church unless they got this spirit of God raised, you know? And so we had these warring souls. Yeah, some of that, seeing yourselves through the eyes of others and all of that, that's mainly been middle-class blacks, but on the spiritual level, it's affected blacks. But the fact is, in the end, that African in you had to come out. And so it leads to that. Now, this spiritual, physical, sacred, secular thing is a central expression of all areas of African American culture. It is central to the music, and the music affects the creative domains of all aspects of our culture. So it affects our literature, it affects our politics, it affects our scientists, you know, scientific thinking, it affects our athletes. I don't care what it is. The highest art form, the music, permeates and influences everything else. So this twin thing, this sacred secular thing, this spirituals of the blues are the spirituals, jazz is the blues. This is a philosophical thing that can override warring minds and warring souls. So what we find then deep inside the culture, you have this twin thought pattern. And this twin thought pattern is a basis for change. When you're undergoing awakening, that's how you bring the history down to earth and put it inside yourself to change yourself. But it has been key to survival for our people. In enslavement, it was the code system used in the spirituals, the messages that were hidden so that they could hide from the psychopathic, racist oppressor their true meaning. And so when they said yes, they meant no. When they sounded like they were waiting to die, they were given instructions for how to escape following the North Star. Those songs contained hidden messages. They were expressing resistance when the oppressor thought that they were expressing submissiveness. This mindset carried us through Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. So what I'm doing is showing you this thing continued down to this day. It's in you. You hear me? And when you do the Brer Rabbit, as some of my friends say, I Brer Rabbited them, brother. You know what I mean? It means that you went down into this bag here. You know what I mean? And this bag here is heavy. And so in Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, where blacks were bulldozed, which means burned alive, you know, and everything else that you could think of to drive us back into a slavery by the state. Frederick Douglass had a saying that slavery was replaced by individual slave masters with society becoming the master. That is, every white becoming the master. But the truth is, slavery was replaced by the state becoming the master. Southern states, northern states, whoever. And they were using their power to keep blacks under subservient economic control. They wanted a labor force that they could bleed, and blacks were resisting. And so when we look at the literature that our people have written, they tell of this, and they give some of the best insights into what our people were facing. And so one of the great pieces of literature is The Invisible Man, written by Ralph Ellison. And Ralph Ellison was a jazz musician. And his book opens with a cryptic message delivered by the grandfather to his grandson. And this message is a message that shows the continuation of this twin mindset, one designed to enable his family and his people to survive, but one that his grandson didn't really understand. And he couldn't tell him until he was on the verge of death, because he probably worried, what would he do with this? But he had to leave him this message. And this was the message to his grandson. Quote, "Keep up the good fight." He then said, "I never told you, but life is a war," meaning black life. We're at war with these whites. He said, "I have been a traitor all my born days, a spy in the enemy's country, ever since I gave up my gun in Reconstruction." He went on to describe the conditions that he and his son or grandson had to live under when he said, quote, "Live with your head in the lion's mouth." That wasn't because he wanted to. That was because that was the circumstance they were faced with during Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, where the Klan was running wild. Then he gave him the key point of how he and most of his people had survived when, after the winning of the Civil War, they were disarmed. He was no traitor. He didn't give up his gun. The gun was taken. We still kept some, but the majority of them were taken. And we know that this country was founded on that principle, that whites could have guns and blacks should not, except when we're fighting in a war where it's in the interest of whites to arm us, except for that. So this was his final message. And this is a message that is the continuation of this thought pattern under very difficult circumstances. And it's the same continuation that we had during enslavement. He said, this was his way for him to survive while concealing what he was really up to. He said, quote, "I want you to overcome them with yeses, undermine them with grins, and agree them to death and destruction. Let them swallow you till they vomit or bust wide open," meaning until you kill them. Now, this was the thought pattern of blacks right after slavery, but it was similar to the one that carried them through slavery. That after slavery, blacks taught their children that they were as good as anybody else, but it was something that they weren't going to say outside of the family. They resented the oppression that they had faced. But they used this twin thought pattern of yes that meant no. This comes out of African thought in this system. It's called, I've renamed this, I call it harmonious conflict. In Africa, even when you're in conflict, the harmony outweighs the conflict. That's why most wars in Africa were fought, and they were not, among Africans, when they were fought, they were not destructive. You know what I mean? Very often you didn't lose any lives, or very few. because the harmony outweighed the conflict. That was true with Native Americans. They had a thing of take and coup, where in a battle, they would touch you. That was a victory, rather than kill you. So this idea of harmony overweighing conflict was flipped in a situation of pure conflict. And so the African in America appears to be going along when he isn't. Because of the way things are set up, you aren't going to be telling somebody that's got all the weaponry and everything else what you're going to do. And so this was a way to carry them through. A friend of mine who was dean of ethnic studies at San Francisco State, Dean Philip McGee, a beautiful brother, the best dean we ever had, Wade Noble's teacher at Stanford, Naim Akbar's best friend. They both went to graduate school, PhD together. I think it was Ohio State. Shared a room together. Phil McGee was dean of the College of Ethnic Studies, and it was a period where they were trying to wipe us out. 90 to 92, Hoover Institute, biggest think tank in the world, the Condoleezza Rice works for. And the CSU, California State University system, they had laid out a campaign to wipe us out. I was chair. And I was shifting the discipline of Africana studies it was then Black studies, from Black studies to a discipline that centered on African philosophy. We had just made that decision when we found out the university had willed our death. And so I took a semester off, rallied the community, 150 community organizations, including organized labor, church, a whole bunch of groups, and threw them at the president. I knew the president, I knew what he wanted, and I also knew that there were certain moves you could make on him that would be very hard for him to resist. And so for 2 years, we had this battle. So for a semester, I took off of reshaping the discipline to wage this fight, and then went back, because you can fight more than one war at the same time. And I don't like to be taken off my main objective. So Phil McGee was dean. And Phil McGee, the dean serves at the will of the president. The president picks you, he can remove you. Your college recommends you, but he can wipe you out anytime you want it. And this president wiped out deans regularly. And these deans were people that served him, kissed his butt, did everything that he wanted them to. He just got satisfaction of, doing his will. That's the white boy system. That's how it works. That's his greatest satisfaction, exercising power. You know what I mean? So, but Phil backed us. But at the same time, he kept his job. How was that? Nebulous, he called it nebulous dualism. Phil, when that president would tell him to support his destroying the department, he'd do a nebulous thing, a grin or whatever, but wouldn't do it. And then would back us. And then there was one point where Phil said, Shaka, hold up for a week. I got to talk to Naim. And he went to see Naim Akbar, to get advice, because Naim's very smart. Phil was too. Wade is too, And he asked Naim, he said, what do you think? And Naim said, and this same question I had, I may have said this before. He said, how much do you think Shaka can get away with? And that was the same question I was raising. So Phil came back and supported us. Nebulous twinness, appearing one way, but being another. Now, that's never been me. I'm in your face. You know exactly where I'm standing. But for some of us, that's been a code for survival. And by the way, on the plantation, old gray hair. So brother named Old Gray Hair. He had been a Fulani colonel, captured in war in Mali, and brought to American enslaved and ran a plantation. And he was called Old Gray Hair. Until the white man, he was this, yes, sir, master. But he was actually a leader in the Loyal League. He was a spy, as the grandfather said, in the ranks of the enemy. in his country. And by this time, he was feeding information to the Civil War, federal troops, on the disposition of troops. Blacks were doing that all over the South. Lee knew that he had nothing but a sieve, because blacks were everywhere giving up information. He knew it, and nothing he could do about it. The one that you thought was the most loyal was the one that gave him a chance, and your throat was cut. You hear me? So this wasn't something that was just for yesterday. And this message that the grandfather left, he said he was a spy in the enemy's country. He understood. This wasn't a country he ran, that he controlled, but he was fighting for his people. And his weapons were his mind. And for the few that could, it was weaponry, because those blacks that keep their weapons, they did. But he was no traitor. He was using a method to keep his family alive, So his real message to his grandson was this: don't fall for my act. This isn't really who I am. My generation, him, had its head in the lion's jaw. But then the generation I came out of was fortunate enough that power relationships had shifted in the world. A rising of Africa, a rising of Asia, a defeat a few miles away from this country in Cuba. Power was shifting. And it's shifting now more than ever. Biden is off here, in this conference, supposed to be delivering something on the environment, and they ain't doing half of what they should be doing, because the corporations in the end are controlling this thing. And so we're in a period of decline. America's now shouting and making noise against China. Why? China's building power. You put your industrial power in their country, and you're complaining about that. You did it. You hear me? And so you're in a period of the fall of the West and the decline and fall of the United States. And when we come up in the movements of the 50s and the 60s, and we are engaging in struggle now, we're another generation. Our heads are not in the lion's jaw anymore. We can now take our head out of the lion's jaw and spear the lion. Of course, you want to say shoot him. That would be the appropriate technological measure you take now. But, when a lion sees a Maasai, that's the only creature that a lion will run from. Because the Maasai, and by the way, this watch band I have here, that's Maasai. That's a Maasai man, Maasai woman. You know what I mean? Carved by Makonde carvers in Tanzania in 1984. And they carved it this way. They said they wanted their African-American brothers to see the beauty of their work. The Maasai's rites of passage from manhood is for a young male to go out with a spear and kill a lion and pull him by the tail before he's dead. And so that big bad lion runs when he sees a Maasai, because built into his internal structure, or hers, is the notion that Maasai's going to kill you. Maasai's going to kill you. And you see, because of the shift of balance of power in the world, my generation and the generations following are like the Maasai. We could spear that lion, take our head out of the jaw and take it out. You know what I mean? Initially, through battles, to win victories for our people, and ultimately to build a just society. So Malcolm X, see, I'm showing you that this still continues. You get this? This still continues, because I know, we feel kind of comfortable with this victim stuff. You know what I mean? And then we had it great, but no more. And most of us, we couldn't possibly be this deep. Enslaved Africans? Oh no. Post-traumatic slave syndrome and all of that. Really? So If we look at Brother Malcolm X, and I'm going to conclude this on myself because I tell my own story, and it ain't all pretty. Malcolm X at one point was influenced by the Platonic Puritan dichotomy of good versus bad, God versus devil, literally. White man is the devil. That was a slave definition of the white man, by the way. Nation didn't invent that one. But his dichotomous thought was house Negro versus field Negro. And then modern day house Negro, that he characterized anybody that wasn't in the Nation of Islam wasn't doing what the nation was for, and he put king in that category, which was absolutely wrong. And he would eventually come to correct it in the sense that he'd move closer to king. And that meeting they had outside of a House chamber where they were both sitting in on the discussion on voting rights legislation, you see that big grin on King and Malcolm's face. And we know that they both shared a lawyer who by the later after a period of time also worked for Malcolm, and he relayed messages between King and Malcolm. And Malcolm really had more respect for King than his propaganda revealed. But the thing is, he was caught up in an either or mentality at one point. Black versus white, good versus bad, either or, But then his thought pattern began to shift. And you saw it full blown when he was forced out of the Nation of Islam. And at that point, he begins to talk about, I'm not for separation, you're not for integration, we're both for freedom. He began to talk about what they had in common. And by the end of Malcolm's life, he was moving more in the direction of King and offering to extend his hand in support of that struggle, meeting with a lot of the forces, including King's forces as well, to try and work out a working relationship. By the end of his life, King was moving towards Malcolm. Because this is one I'm not going into, but this ain't just twin. The blues of the spirituals doesn't just mean the blues complement the spirituals. They're one. That's a whole nother story. Now, my transformation was similar to Malcolm's. It was from an either or thought pattern. Hardcore. I was hardcore. You might think I still am. Maybe so. But you should have seen me then. You know what I mean? And that condition, as I got into Dogon philosophy, as I began to identify the governing principles of African American deep thought, it led me to begin to slowly rearrange my philosophy and my thought pattern, as well as my attitude, communication, and behavior pattern. It was gradual. And that's why, when people hear this stuff, this is a discussion of ideas, but it really is experience. And so if you don't go through this experience, this is talk, but you got to do the walk. And so that's what this is about. And so over a period of time, I began to rearrange my philosophy from a Platonic to a Dogon to Yoruba, Asante, Kemetic, and particularly to New African. These have to occur simultaneously because one is the basis for the other. One is the root. But if you're going to internalize it, then you're living in your reality. And you're going to have to internalize it through your reality. So I say, for example, I apprenticed under the Dogon system. I wasn't in Dogon country. I couldn't speak their language. I didn't apprentice under their masters. It was indirect apprenticeship. Because I couldn't, just as they couldn't leave their village, I can't leave mine. I'm engaged in a struggle lifelong. But I adapted those principles to our reality and used a mastery system that I'm writing about now that was the same, that I didn't know in the beginning was the same. I later discovered that they were basically, the same system. So in my case, the Spiritual blues was like, that is the philosophy behind it. Spirituals are the blues, the sacred is the secular, and vice versa. Uh, this was real key for internal balance. And it set the tone for me to be able to eventually, when I went through a spiritual awakening, to come up with seeing this thing that leads to the twin lineal family thing. It comes from this twin thing that's basic to both our cultures. It's deep in the deepest thought that comes from our people. So this change in philosophy from an either or thought pattern led to a change in attitude from Negro to Black and African. This change led to a thought pattern that gave me and people like me, my good friend Norman Brown, who didn't need to go through this awakening because he came from Zora Neale's Eatonville, first Black town organized by Blacks, whereas he said he didn't see a white person until he was 18 years old. You know what I mean? But it was through brothers like Norman who woke me up, and through brothers and sisters in struggle, and through the transformations that we went through, that we were able to change our thought patterns to a higher, more complex thought pattern that transcended that of the enemy. It enabled us through the San Francisco Freedom Movement to be the only Black movement in the North, both during the Black Freedom Movement and Black Power phase, to defeat an entire economic power structure and do much more. I've mentioned some of it before. There's a couple of tapes on it on this show. It was a spiritual blues philosophy and thought pattern that instilled in us dignity, pride, fearlessness, endless creativity, and of course, the awakening that we went through did that. And enabled us to take complex battlefields, break it down, and defeat it. And that's the healthiest thing in your life, is to be successful under oppression against your oppressor. That's the healthiest thing. So we didn't any longer have to deal with this nebulous dualism, which has never been my forte and wasn't my father's either. I should point out that not all Blacks during the period of enslavement, not all Blacks during the period of Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction took the nebulous route. Those were those who were straight in your face, like my father, you know. But in my case, the world situation helped us out. We weren't alone anymore. We had balance of forces that were global. That means something, that we could do stuff that we couldn't do before. And we could draw from a global reality that also affected our thought pattern. Africans rising in Africa, Asians rising in Asia, the Cuban Revolution. Those things all affected our attitudes, our thoughts. And then what we did, the movements of our people for liberation, inspired people around the world. And so they were liberating in both cases. So this twin tradition is very important. You hear me? It's in the souls of Black folks. It connects you to the cosmos, you know? If you're a male, it gets you to incline towards a more sensitive feminine side. You already got your physical and other strengths that are the masculine. And if you're female, to draw from that creative side, but while you're nurturing and caring and strong, you know. This is the way of the cosmos. This is a part of being a cosmic man or a cosmic woman. And it's this kind of orientation, this kind of balance, this kind of transformation that will enable us to save this planet, let alone restructure this society. So I hope you got something out of that. Hotep. I see Adolfo Austin, a brother I haven't seen in a long time. I saw you befriend me, I think, on Facebook, and he's got a comment here, nebulous dualism. Baba, I miss our talks, your teachings, and our work. So happy to find you here. Yes, a brother I've known for a long, long time. Hey, right on, brother. If you got any questions, put them up there or comments. Christopher Sompel, why aren't you complaining you did put our industrial power into China? Facts. Yeah, he's quoting something that I said. Yeah. They looked at the nose, that is the immediate, the profit, you know. They ain't thinking about where his power going or anything else. As one old white lady said, it was on a C-SPAN channel. She said, well, if we go to war against a country like China, who's going to manufacture our stuff? Good question. Of course, there is a manufacturing base here, and it could tool up. But the fact is, they're way behind. You know what I mean? To impoverish America so a few people could be rich, they've gone against their best interests. You want to talk about dumb? Give me a break. Give me a break. Nix0077. I like some of these names y'all got. You know what I mean? Our people use music and stories as what Dogons call Sodaya. Yeah, well, Sodaya is a whole nother level. So that's clear word. Now they did use drawings, which is a Dunaso, wisdom or knowledge of the world that they drew in sand. But these abstract drawings are so complex that if you haven't mastered Juriso, Beniso, Boloso, the first 3 degrees, which means you have to be those things, you can forget about Sodaya. But I know what you're saying. There are symbols and there are stories. But everyday people didn't get these stories because that's for the masters. They got the simple truth. They got the truth that they were prepared for. But to get to this level, one reason why these things were secret is there was power that came with the knowledge. And if you give somebody certain kind of knowledge and they're not responsible, that power can be used to harm humanity and to harm Mother Nature. So people who got to that level, they had earned this, and therefore certain things they had learned, they just couldn't go around passing it on. You know what I mean? Because you had to be responsible enough to get it. And in African thought, to get this, you got to be this. You know, Christopher Sample, Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, B.B. King, Robert Johnson, etc. are the root of hard rock. My ill-informed people think that Led Zeppelin are the fathers of hard rock and roll. I tell them all the time. Very good, brother. Yeah, very good. Howlin' Wolf, one bad brother. He didn't take no mess. He didn't want no Cadillac. Give him his money. Big old brother, too. You know, big old brother. You don't mess with him. Muddy Waters, one of the best bluesmen ever. He got that name because of playing in the mud when he was a child. Absolute beauty. B.B. King, Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson's at the foundation. Yeah, he's right. You know what I mean? Hard rock and all of that, it's all an imitation. You know what I mean? And it's a poor imitation too. Because in order to sing the blues, you have to live it. You know what I mean? Very few whites can sing the blues. Very few. And when they do, they get the sound. They don't necessarily get the feeling, but very few. And not all blacks can sing the blues either, because it's not only the feeling they have to have, it's a certain kind of experience that they have to have as well. Let's see what else we have here. Brother Lynn Mosley, he's asking, brother, did you happen to write down the other Lerone Bennett book Baba Tashaka emphasized? I got Negro Mood, but didn't catch the other one he said was key to read. The Shaping of Black America. And of course, they came before the Mayflower. Most people know that one. One other thing I really liked about Lerone Bennett is, particularly in many of his writings, he had great artwork. He would bring in, he had a great artist who did the paintings for a lot of his books. And that was also good because he was being backed by Johnson Publication, Ebony Magazine and Jet Magazine. And so that showed that the owner had a value for history and culture, and Lerone Bennett was quite good. Lerone Bennett attended the Sixth Pan-African Congress. He was not a delegate. And because of his prominence, he was asked by the vice president of Tanzania to give an impromptu speech. And he got up and spoke. I'd never heard him speak before. The man could speak. Wasn't just a good writer, good speaker, So that's important. I see Hercules Bell today. So-called rhythm and blues is just radio porn. I feel like neo soul is a true evolution of blues music. Let's see if there's anything else here. Yeah, Brother Ogawa is suggesting that you all click the like button, family, help the algorithms pass this video to more eyes, and post the ad for this show and other shows on whatever platform you're on. James Pooh, isn't repetition fundamental principle of communication? Shouldn't master communicators tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them, then test them? Repetition is important, but then change the circumstances and change the context so it's interesting. So it's not just repeating, and people can say, "Oh, I heard that before." But yeah, it is repetition. And in African philosophy, Dogon in particular, when they use the Adunaso symbol, they're always taking you to another level. It's just like the musician. They might play the same song more than once, but never the same way. So it's that way in our culture because of the creativity of our people. Cinnabar, the spiritual is nothing but the blues. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true. Okay, I think, let me see, there's a new comment down here. Let me go down here and see what that one is. This is Oziah P.A.P.O. Greetings, Dr. Tashaka. I met you years ago at State of Black Oakland Conference. Are you currently offering any classes or teaching online or otherwise? Yes. I announced at the beginning of this show, and each show I announced this, there's going to be a year-long webinar when we've enrolled enough people, and it's on the sixfold stages to mental freedom. That's a system for waking up, something you really can't teach in a college, except as a theory. So this will be a year-long thing, twice a month. And so people who are interested should contact me at my email address, O, and then T as in Tom, S as in Sam, O Tashaka, at SBC as Sam, SBC, global.net. Global.com. Yeah, global.com. O Tashaka at SBC global.net. I think it's global.net. Email me and let me know that you're interested, and we'll put you in a file. Okay, that looks like it's it. I hope you got something out of this. I put some work into this, but this is like heart and soul, because this is your heart and soul. So, Hotep.